If you're so smart, translate, the millionaire mocked, but the cleaning lady left him speechless. The morning cold cut through the windows of the 30th floor like an icy blade. The silence in the boardroom was thick, uncomfortable, broken only by the tick-tock of the clock hanging on the white marble wall. Among the long tables and expensive suits, everyone held their breath. And in the middle of them, him, Marcus, impeccable, with his hair slicked back and a smile as sharp as his tongue. His grey eyes scanned the room looking for his next victim, because for Marcus, humiliation was an art, and that morning he was inspired. Catherine was already there. With her back straight and eyes downcast, she bent gracefully to clean someone's shoe prints from the gleaming floor. No one really saw her. No one noticed her hastily pulled back hair, her hands roughened by work, or the tenderness with which she treated even the most thankless corners of that building. No one, except Marcus, that morning. Because when his eyes found her, an almost imperceptible flash of disdain lit up his face. She felt the weight of his gaze before she even dared to lift her head. She knew him by sight. She knew he owned everything her hands cleaned each night and each morning. And she also knew that men like him don't speak to women like her. Not out of respect, but out of indifference. But that morning was different. The metallic sound of a briefcase hitting the table jolted her. Marcus rose from his chair with a gesture of contained annoyance and walked, to everyone's surprise, toward Catherine. The contained laughter of the executives floated like a poisonous murmur behind him. In his hands he carried some printed papers, stained with the ink of million-dollar contracts and promises of success. She barely managed to straighten up when he spoke to her, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "If you're as smart as you seem to pretend," he spat with a twisted smile. "Translate this." Catherine looked at him. For the first time she looked him straight in the eye. Time seemed to stop for a second in that frozen room while she, with flushed cheeks and tense hands, felt something new awakening in her chest. Her eyes settled on the sheets he was waving in front of her, on the mocking looks of everyone around, on her own challenged dignity. And then inside, Catherine decided that this would be the last day someone like Marcus would treat her as if she didn't exist. He didn't know it yet, but he had just unleashed a storm. Sometimes the most powerful men are the ones who least understand how fragile the pedestal they stand on can be, and how quickly someone with enough courage can bring it down. Stay here, because what happened next not only left Marcus speechless, but changed their lives forever. If this story is already touching your heart, subscribe right now so you don't miss a single second of this intense battle of pride, love and redemption. And so, while Catherine's eyes shone with fire for the first time, Marcus still smiled, unaware that his entire world was about to crumble. Catherine let her eyes fall on the paper Marcus had thrown at her. She felt the heat rising to her face and at the same time, a strange calm seeping between her shame and her rage. The printed words danced before her, and she knew in an instant that she couldn't allow herself to fail. She knew what they said. She knew what to answer. But more than anything, she knew that this was the moment she had been waiting for without knowing it. Because Catherine hadn't always been a woman who went unnoticed. She remembered like a sharp pain the afternoons at the public library in the neighborhood, when she was still a teenager, devouring English books with a notebook on her knees and a borrowed dictionary. While her friends danced at festivals and went out for walks, she stayed alone in a corner of the room, translating stories and underlining words with pencil. She didn't do it for love of the language, nor for any dream of traveling far, but because her father used to tell her that everything she learned, no one could take away from her. And now, so many years later, those lessons resonated within her. But between the books and the study afternoons came the misfortunes, her mother's illness, the father who disappeared without saying goodbye, the debts that accumulated until they suffocated her. And Catherine had to bend to the world, accept poorly paid jobs and endless hours, until she ended up cleaning the same building she once looked at from the street like an unreachable miracle. Her English remained hidden, like a shameful secret that no one bothered to discover. And yet, there she was now. The most powerful man in the room was pointing at her with a finger full of arrogance, calling her smart in a mocking tone, and inviting her to prove it in front of everyone. Catherine lifted her gaze and met Marcus's eyes. Something in her straightened up, something that had been sleeping for a long time. It wasn't just her hands that were trembling, it was her pride that shook her from within, demanding to be heard. He raised an eyebrow, satisfied to see her tremble. That made her angrier. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice loaded with venom. "Weren't you so intelligent?" Translate it. "Come on, stop wasting our time." The murmur of laughter and whispers in the room grew louder. She felt her cheeks burning, and even so she took a step forward. She took the paper from his hands delicately, read quickly, and then took a deep breath. The following words came out of her mouth clean, clear, and with a precision that made the murmur stop dead. Each sentence she pronounced was a dagger in the air, a silent challenge that fell upon Marcus, gradually erasing his smile. Because the woman he had humiliated, the one no one saw, had just shown that her intelligence was greater than his own arrogance. And in that instant, although he didn't know it yet, something in him also broke. While Catherine left the paper on the table and turned to return to her bucket, no one dared to say a single word. Marcus's eyes followed her to the door, frozen, as if he had just witnessed a magic trick he couldn't explain. And she, for the first time in years, walked upright. There inside her, something told her that this wasn't ending there. Because if he thought he could keep trampling on her, he was wrong. And if he thought that small display would leave him unscathed, he would soon learn that Catherine hadn't survived so much just to bow her head again. He from his crystal throne, and she from her marble floor still had much to say to each other, and the battle, though silent, was just beginning. The following hours passed wrapped in a strange, almost unbearable quiet. No one talked too much in the hallways. No one dared to look at her directly when she passed by pushing her bucket of water and mop. Catherine could feel the stares on her back, the murmur of voices that faded as soon as she crossed the threshold. She knew what they were thinking. That a simple cleaning woman had dared to stand up to Marcus, the untouchable. That she had pronounced those words in English with a serenity that contrasted with her boss's silent fury. That she had stripped him naked in front of everyone without raising her voice. But she wasn't fooling herself. She knew men like him. She knew that wounded arrogance was dangerous, that he wouldn't forgive her for making him look ridiculous in front of the entire room. Inside, her heart beat so hard that sometimes she felt it could be heard for miles, and yet, she didn't regret it. When the clock struck 3 in the afternoon, the most important meeting of the quarter began. The atmosphere in the boardroom was dense, almost suffocating. Dark-suited executives, women in skirts and high heels, documents piled on the table, and half-finished steaming coffees filled the space with a nervous murmur. Everyone was there. It was $1 million contract with a foreign client. Nothing could go wrong. Catherine had no reason to be present. She had already finished her shift on that floor and was planning to leave. But before leaving, she decided to make one last pass through the adjacent empty room to collect some forgotten cutlery. She didn't expect to find anything out of the ordinary, but there he was, Marcus, standing next to the table, reviewing papers with clenched hands. His hair fell slightly over his forehead, and his jaw tensed as he read and rearranged sheets. There was something almost desperate in the way his eyes scanned the words, as if the usual security that surrounded him had disappeared, leaving only a man struggling not to sink. When he noticed her presence, he looked up with a glacial smile. "How convenient, Catherine," he said, his voice with an edge. "Since you know so much, maybe you'd like to stay and translate live, in front of everyone, to prove that this morning wasn't luck." She looked at him without blinking. Something inside her whispered that she should accept, that she shouldn't back down. So, without uttering a word, she entered the room and positioned herself standing next to the head of the table, waiting. The executives' murmurs grew as soon as they realized. No one knew what the hell the cleaning woman was doing there. "What are you waiting for?" Marcus asked, turning toward those present. "Don't you see, here we have our bilingual genius. Who better to help us now?" The contained laughter echoed off the walls. Catherine felt her hands freeze, but she didn't give in. She took the papers he handed her, with that same mockery in his gaze, and began to read them, word by word, with the same clarity as before, even correcting a couple of errors that Marcus had overlooked. And little by little, silence fell over the room again. The laughter faded, the look stopped being mocking, and became astonished. Marcus, however, remained standing, motionless, with an expression no one could read. When she finished, Catherine left the papers on the table and gave him one last look before turning to leave. Nothing more was needed. He knew. Everyone knew. At that moment, something broke. Marcus's pedestal began to crack before his very eyes, and she, crossing the door, knew it, that had been her small victory. But she also knew that the war wasn't over, because there are wounds that take time to heal, and hearts too hard to admit that something inside them has already begun to change. The door closed behind her with a soft click, but in Marcus's mind that sound echoed like a cannonball. He remained motionless in front of the table, with his hands resting on the polished wood, his knuckles white from the force with which he gripped it. For the first time in a long time, his employees' looks weren't of respect or fear, but of something more uncomfortable. Pity? Surprise? He felt an unbearable heat in his cheeks, a weight in his chest he couldn't explain. She had made him look like a fool in front of everyone, a woman who shouldn't even be there, who cleaned the corners he never bothered to look at, a woman who had known more than he did. The executives' murmur began to grow as each one collected their things and left with awkward excuses. No one wanted to stay to witness his anger. He didn't want them to see him like this either. With a brusque gesture, he released the papers onto the table, disorganizing them, and turned toward the window. There, with his hands in his pockets and his gaze lost in the gray sky of New York, he tried to compose himself. But he couldn't. No matter how hard he tried, his mind returned again and again to the same image. Catherine's eyes shining with defiance as she pronounced each word with that firm and serene voice. As if he didn't intimidate her, as if nothing in that room could crush her. "Damn it," he murmured, barely audible. That night, unrest followed him to his penthouse. He paced back and forth, with a glass of whiskey in his hand, remembering every moment of the day. His wounded pride tangled in his chest like an impossible knot to untie, and along with it, something even more dangerous, a growing curiosity about that woman he had never really looked at. How had someone like her learned to master that language? How had she hidden so much talent, so much confidence behind a bucket and a cheap uniform? He slept little and poorly, and the next day, the first thing he did when he arrived was to ask human resources for Catherine's complete file. But there was nothing more than a name, an address, and a start date. That irritated him even more. He then decided he needed to confront her. He needed to understand her, or at least regain the control she had taken from him. Because one thing was certain, he wasn't going to remain looking like an idiot, while everyone continued whispering behind his back. That afternoon he found her in the lobby, alone, folding a rag with parsimony. She noticed him instantly, but didn't lift her gaze. "Catherine," he said, with a grave voice. She straightened up slowly, with a calm that disarmed him. For a moment he didn't know what to say to her. He had never been left speechless in front of anyone, but there he was, in front of her, like a child caught in the act. She raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I need to talk to you," he managed to say finally, although his voice sounded less firm than he would have wanted. Catherine took a deep breath and left the rag on the cart. And for the first time in a long time, he felt how the ground beneath his feet stopped feeling solid. Sometimes, when someone touches our deepest wounds, we don't know whether to hate them or surrender to what they awaken in us. And now I ask you who are listening to this story, what would you have done in his place? Would you forgive such humiliation, or would you return every blow? Leave me your answer in the comments. I want to know how you would react in such an unexpected situation. Marcus didn't know it yet, but every word that would come out of his mouth that day would be as important as the first time he challenged her in front of everyone. And Catherine, well, Catherine was about to show him that dignity is not negotiable. Catherine followed him silently to a small empty office at the end of the hallway. Marcus closed the door behind them with a slight click and remained standing, facing her, like a man who didn't know where to begin. For an instant, both looked at each other, measuring forces in that thick silence that formed between them. He with his hands in his pockets, his gray gaze fixed on her, trying to regain control. She with her arms crossed, her chin high, with that same silent fire that had disarmed him from the first time. "Yesterday," he began, his voice lower than he intended, "you overstepped." Catherine raised an eyebrow, and a small ironic smile formed on her face. "Overstep?" she asked slowly, almost sweetly. "I only translated what you asked me to." He gritted his teeth, pacing back and forth like a caged lion. His shoes echoed against the floor, and each step seemed to contain all the frustration he felt. "I didn't ask you to correct me in front of everyone," he growled, with a hint of rage in his voice. "That was unnecessary." Catherine took a deep breath, without looking away from him. "What was unnecessary?" she replied calmly. "Was your way of addressing me." The words floated in the air like a slap, and Marcus stopped dead. He looked at her for a long time, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to say. No one in years had spoken to him like that. No one had had the courage to remind him that beneath his expensive suit and his last name, he was still a man as vulnerable as any other. Something in his chest stirred, uncomfortable, and at the same time, strange. "You're right," he finally admitted, almost in a whisper. Catherine blinked, surprised to hear him. She saw him lower his gaze for an instant, as if those two words had cost him a very high price. "But I don't like," he added immediately, raising his eyes again. "I don't like being made to look ridiculous." Catherine sketched a slight smile. "Nobody likes it," she said, and for the first time, he also smiled. Just for an instant, just a gesture at the corner of his lips, but it was there. Marcus took a step closer, lowering his voice, as if he feared someone might hear them. "I want to understand you," he finally said. "To know who you really are, how you learned what you know, why no one knew it until now." Catherine looked at him seriously, but her heart gave a small leap hearing those words. There was something genuine in that plea disguised as curiosity. "I'm nobody special," she whispered, looking away, but he shook his head slowly, almost tenderly. "I wouldn't be so sure about that." Silence settled between them again, but it was different from the beginning. There was something new floating there, a silent recognition that this war they thought they were waging was in reality a duel disguised as an approach. Catherine felt for the first time in years that someone was really looking at her, and Marcus for the first time in his life that there was something more important than his own pride. Both remained still for one more instant, as if they feared breaking the spell, until she, with a light sigh, took her bucket and opened the door to leave. He watched her walk away in silence, with the strange sensation that for the first time, he had lost a battle, and that it didn't bother him as much as he had thought. The following days brought with them a strange routine. Each morning, upon arriving at the building, Catherine found a handwritten note from Marcus in her locker with instructions. They were small but unusual tasks: translating emails from foreign clients, reviewing contracts, drafting responses in English. No cleaning, no buckets or rags. At first, Catherine thought it was a disguised punishment, an attempt to watch her closely or make her uncomfortable enough to quit. But as the days passed, she realized that this was something else. Marcus needed her. He, for his part, didn't admit it even to himself. He only knew that he couldn't allow himself to be humiliated again in front of a foreign client, and that the only person capable of keeping his image intact was that woman whose name he didn't even know before. But there was something more, something that burned inside him every time he saw her sit in front of him, with her half-pulled back hair and her low voice correcting his mistakes without a trace of mockery. They worked together in a small meeting room, isolated from the rest of the office, with a pile of documents between them, and a silence that little by little filled with something different. At first it was just tension, then curiosity, and finally something softer. Catherine began to notice that Marcus wasn't just the arrogant man she had known. There were discreet gestures of fatigue in him, absent looks when he thought no one saw him, and a way of rubbing his temples when the numbers didn't add up that made him seem almost vulnerable. One afternoon, while they reviewed a report together, she dared to break the silence. "You don't sleep well," she said, without looking at him directly. He looked up, surprised. "And how do you know that?" "Because you have the same eyes I had when my mother was sick, and I spent nights without sleeping a wink." The words remained floating between them. For a moment, Marcus lowered his gaze and nodded, as if what she had just said was too true to deny. "It's not easy to sleep," he murmured, "when you have the feeling that everything could collapse at any moment." Catherine looked at him for a long time. For the first time, her heart softened toward him. Because behind the impeccable suit and the hard gaze, there was a man who carried his own solitude. From that day on, Marcus began to seek her presence, even outside work hours. When he saw her cross the hallways, his eyes followed her without being able to help it. And she, despite herself, also began to wait for those moments of shared silence, those small conversations on the margin of everything else. Without realizing it, the barriers they had erected between them began to crack. One Thursday night after a long day, she was putting away the last papers in a folder when he stopped her with a gesture. "Catherine," he said, with a quiet voice, "you don't have to stay if you don't want to." She remained still with her hands on the folder and barely smiled. "But I want to," she answered, without looking at him. In that instant, he knew that what he was feeling for her wasn't just gratitude or simple attraction. It was something he couldn't name yet, but that pushed him to keep looking for her, to keep looking at her as if among so many people, only she was real. And Catherine, while collecting her purse to leave, felt for the first time in a long time a slight hope growing in her chest. Both knew they were crossing a dangerous line, but neither did anything to stop. That night, rain pounded the building's windows like a persistent murmur. The entire city seemed wrapped in a melancholic gray, and the silence of the small room where they worked together weighed more than ever. Marcus leafed through a random contract without looking, while Catherine, sitting across from him, remained quiet, with her hands intertwined on the table. It was late, too late to still be there, but neither wanted to be the first to get up. Finally, it was she who spoke. "You weren't always like this, were you?" she asked in a low voice. He looked up, surprised by the question, as if someone had crossed a door that had been closed for years. "Like what?" he replied, pretending not to understand. "So hard," she responded. "So cold." Marcus remained silent, with his gaze lost at some point on the wall. Catherine thought he wouldn't answer, but then he let out a long, almost resigned sigh. "Not always," he admitted. "There was a time when I trusted people, when I believed that being good was enough for things to turn out well." She looked at him gently, perceiving in his voice a sadness she hadn't heard before. "And what happened?" she dared to ask. Marcus sketched a bitter smile. "I discovered that people take advantage of those who trust too much," he murmured. "I lost money, friends, a woman who I thought loved me, and I learned that here in this world, if you're not the strongest, they crush you." Catherine lowered her gaze, feeling a knot in her throat. She knew well what it was to lose, what it was to harden oneself to survive. But seeing him like this, confessing his pain with that broken voice, disarmed her. "Not everyone is like that," she said in a whisper. "Not everyone seeks to crush others." He looked at her then with a new intensity in his eyes. "And you?" he asked. "Wouldn't you do it, if you had the opportunity? Wouldn't you return every blow?" Catherine remained quiet, because the truth was that for years she had dreamed of that, of returning every humiliation, every contempt. But now, seeing him like this, so different from the arrogant man who had challenged her days ago, she wondered if it was worth it. And he, seeing her silence, understood that the wound she carried was as deep as his. Both remained a few seconds looking at each other, without need for more words. Because sometimes it's not about winning or losing, but about finding someone who recognizes your pain and doesn't run away. The rain kept falling outside, covering the city with its murmur. And in that room, illuminated by a single dim lamp, Catherine and Marcus understood that something inside them was changing. If you also feel that knot in your chest, seeing how two wounded souls begin to find comfort in each other, leave your like right now to support this story, and let more people discover it. Because there are moments when dignity hurts as much as love, and yet, both deserve to be defended. Catherine looked away, swallowing, while he leaned barely toward her, as if he were going to say something more. But instead of words, the only thing they shared was that silence loaded with unspoken promises, and although neither of them knew it yet, the night was just beginning. The following days were a strange whirlwind for both. The tension between them kept growing. Although neither dared to name it, Catherine continued fulfilling the tasks Marcus assigned her, but something in her gaze had changed. She no longer challenged him with her eyes. She no longer stayed a few extra seconds at the end of the day, and he, for his part, began to notice the difference. One afternoon, in a meeting with foreign executives, Marcus lost control again. The pressures of the contract, the uncomfortable questions, and his own wounded pride led him to explode in front of everyone. And when Catherine, once again, intervened to calm the situation and translate with precision what he hadn't known how to answer, Marcus shot her a hard look and a cruel comment. "You're nobody to tell me how to handle my business," he spat, in front of everyone. The words were like a whip. Catherine froze, feeling the blood drain from her cheeks. She swallowed, lowered her gaze, and finished the translation without responding. But that night she didn't return to the usual room, nor the next, nor the other. For the first time since all of this began, Catherine decided not to appear anymore. She only fulfilled her cleaning duties and avoided any contact with him. Marcus, at first, pretended it didn't matter to him. But each day that passed, the absence of that serene and challenging presence ate at him from within. The office seemed emptier to him, the afternoons longer, the meetings colder. He began to notice details he had previously ignored. The corner of the room she used to leave impeccable, the folders organized with a delicacy no one else achieved, and even his own bad mood, which had grown again like a shadow over everyone else. One night, unable to bear his own restlessness anymore, he decided to go out and walk through the city. The wet streets and yellow streetlights reminded him of his silent conversations with Catherine, his stolen glances, the way she made him feel human. He stopped short when he realized how much it hurt not to see her, because that's what she had done to him, without even intending to. She had disarmed him. She had entered his cold world, full of marble and crystal, and left him seeing his own cracks. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay staring at the ceiling of his penthouse, wondering at what moment he had become someone capable of hurting, the only person who had had the courage to look him in the face like that. And for the first time in years, Marcus felt a deep emptiness in his chest. One that money, power, and appearances couldn't fill. The next morning, still with tired eyes and wrinkled clothes, he knew what he had to do. It was time to set aside pride, to confront her, and to tell her what he had never said to anyone. Because sometimes, only when the right person walks away, do we understand what it really means to lose. He found her in the least expected place, a small park a few blocks from the building, at the end of the afternoon, sitting on a bench while the sky dressed in orange and violet tones. Catherine held a closed book in her hands, her gaze lost at some point on the horizon. Marcus watched her from afar for an instant, without daring to take the first step. His heart beat so fast that it was difficult for him to breathe. He had never felt fear when approaching someone, but with her it was different, because he knew that his last name or his money wasn't enough. With Catherine it wasn't enough to be Marcus, he had to be himself. Finally he took a deep breath and walked toward her. Catherine looked up when she heard his footsteps. Her eyes shone with surprise, but her expression remained firm, serene. "What are you doing here?" she asked with a low voice. Marcus remained standing in front of her without answering immediately. He looked at her for a long time, as if trying to memorize every detail, the way the evening light played with her hair, the soft shadows on her face, the silent dignity in her posture. "I came to ask for your forgiveness," he finally said. Catherine blinked, surprised. "I don't expect anything from you," she murmured, looking away. He took a step closer. "I know," he responded, "but I owe you more than that." Catherine looked at him again, with eyes full of questions. "The other day, when I spoke to you like that in front of everyone, it wasn't because you deserved it," Marcus continued with a broken voice. "It was because you scared me, because I saw myself reflected in you, because you are everything I wanted to be someday, and forgot how." She narrowed her eyes, doubting whether to believe him. "I'm nobody," Catherine whispered, but Marcus shook his head slowly, with a sad half-smile. "You are someone," he said, "someone who taught me that I still have something good inside, someone who taught me that there are other ways to be strong." Catherine felt her defenses beginning to crack. His words, so honest, so different from his usual hardness, reached her heart. Marcus then knelt in front of her, not caring about his suit or the damp ground of the park. He looked up and took her hands carefully. "I'm not here just to apologize," he continued. "I'm here to tell you that since you came into my life, I can't stop thinking about you, that I need you, that I want to learn to be better, if you let me try." Catherine felt a knot in her throat. She looked at him there, vulnerable, surrendered, and for the first time allowed herself to smile. "And what will happen when I make mistakes?" she asked, in a thread of voice. He smiled too, squeezing her hands tighter. "Then it will be my turn to remind you that nobody is perfect," he responded. "But I don't plan to let you feel invisible ever again." The silence that followed was sweet, almost unreal. Only the murmur of the leaves and the last sun bathing the city accompanied that moment. Catherine, with tears at the edge of her eyes, nodded slowly, and in that instant, both knew that everything had changed forever. Because sometimes, one sincere look is enough to tear down the highest walls. Winter had finally surrendered to the first light of spring. The building that once seemed cold and distant now had a different air, warmer, more human. On the 30th floor, the same marble room where it all began was full of fresh flowers on the tables, and a soft lavender scent floated in the air. Catherine entered with a firm step, an elegant beige dress that fell softly over her figure, and a folder under her arm. No one looked at her anymore as the woman with the bucket. Everyone greeted her with respect, some even with a smile, because in a few months she had proven that her talent knew no limits, that her words could open doors that even Marcus didn't know existed. He was waiting for her by the window as always, in a light grey suit, and the same half smile that only she knew. When he saw her enter, his eyes shone with pride, and she felt the same fire in her chest from that first day. He approached her and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear before whispering, "Ready for your first big project?" Catherine smiled, confident in herself. "I was always ready." They both walked together to the head of the table, surrounded by attentive looks. He, the millionaire who had learned to listen. She, the woman who dared to challenge him and taught him that true strength is not crushing, but lifting up. As they presented their proposal in English, firm and coordinated like a single team, Marcus couldn't help but glance at her sideways and wonder how he had survived so long without noticing how extraordinary she was. And Catherine, for her part, knew that she would never again let anyone humiliate her because now she knew who she was. That night, while the city slept, he took her hand through the quiet streets. They stopped in front of the park where they had reconciled weeks ago, and Marcus hugged her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "I never imagined," he whispered, "that I would find someone like you here." Catherine closed her eyes and smiled, resting her hands over his. "Nor did I imagine that someone like you would dare to look at me like this," she responded. And in that instant, they understood that the marble and crystal didn't matter, nor the money or titles. What mattered was that feeling of being seen, of being chosen, of being respected. Because we all deserve that, to be looked at as if we mattered, even if no one else believes it. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that we all have dignity and worth, subscribe right now so you don't miss more stories that inspire, move, and remind us what really matters. Marcus and Catherine continued walking under the city lights, holding hands, ready to write together the next chapter of their story, because sometimes a simple "translate this" is enough to also translate the language of the soul, and discover that behind every wound, there's always someone capable of healing us.